Gospel Topics Essays, Plural Marriage in Kirtland and Nauvoo, Part 1. In this series, I will thoroughly examine the Gospel Topics essays published on the official LDS Church website. Each essay will be addressed in the order presented by the Church, offering a critical and in-depth analysis of the topics they cover. As the LDS Church continues to break this down into further in-depth articles, I will be exposing their distortions and contradictions in follow-up videos, addressing each point in the order they present it. Since this topic essay is lengthy, I will be breaking it down into a two-part episode. This is part 1 of 2. Part 1, Plural Marriage in Kirtland and Nauvoo. The essay opens with, Latter-day Saints believe that monogamy, the marriage of one man and one woman, is the Lord's standing law of marriage. In biblical times, the Lord commanded some of his people to practice plural marriage, the marriage of one man and more than one woman. Some early members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints also received and obeyed this commandment given through God's prophets. Let's break this down plain and simple. The LDS Church has been straight up gaslighting its members about so-called biblical polygamy, and it's time to torch that nonsense. In no way did God command Abraham to take a second wife. That's an LDS spin job, and anyone actually reading the text would see it. Let's pull it up and settle this like adults. In Genesis 16 verse 1-3 we read, Now Sarai Abram's wife bare him no children, and she had an handmaid, an Egyptian, whose name was Hagar. And Sarai said unto Abram, Behold now, the Lord hath restrained me from bearing. I pray thee, go in unto my maid, it may be that I may obtain children by her. And Abram hearkened to the voice of Sarai. Where's the divine command in that? Where's God saying, Abraham, I command you to take Hagar? Spoiler, it doesn't exist. Sarah is the one making the offer, and Abraham agrees to it. End of story. No angelic visit, no revelation, no command. It's literally Sarah's idea born of desperation. The LDS Church is flat out lying when it tries to frame this as a God-sanctioned polygamous relationship. And it gets better. Let's tackle Jacob while we're at it. The Church loves to claim Jacob was commanded into polygamy. Absolute garbage. There's not a single verse in the Bible where God commands Jacob to marry more than one wife. What actually happened? He was deceived. Genesis 29:25 spells it out. And it came to pass that in the morning, behold, it was Leah. And he said to Laban, What is this thou hast done unto me? Did not I serve with thee for Rachel? Wherefore then hast thou beguiled me? Jacob was supposed to marry Rachel, one wife, but Laban pulled a fast one and swapped in Leah. Then, to get Rachel, Jacob agreed to serve another 7 years. No command from God. None. Zip, nada. And what happened next? Leah and Rachel, out of jealousy, started handing over their servants to Jacob as concubines. Again, no divine command, just human scheming, sibling rivalry, and a desperate race to pop out the most kids. Sound familiar? It's exactly like Sarah and Hagar. So let's cut the crap. The LDS Church has been gaslighting members for generations with cherry-picked, twisted half-truths about biblical polygamy to prop up Joseph Smith's abusive, self-serving polygamy doctrine. It's manipulation, plain and simple. Anyone still defending it hasn't cracked open a Bible in years. The Church moves on with, after receiving a revelation commanding him to practice plural marriage, Joseph Smith married multiple wives and introduced the practice to close associates. This principle was among the most challenging aspects of the Restoration, for Joseph personally and for other church members. Plural marriage tested faith and provoked controversy and opposition. Few Latter-day Saints initially welcomed the restoration of a biblical practice entirely foreign to their sensibilities. But many later testified of powerful spiritual experiences that helped them overcome their hesitation and gave them courage to accept this practice. If God truly commanded polygamy with the supposed restoration, then why was Emma Smith left out in the cold knowing about these marriages? Why would it be that Joseph and his associates were hiding it from her and the other members? If Joseph were truly a prophet, would his followers not accept a revelation concerning polygamy? What personal challenges did Joseph face? Those of hiding his illegal actions from Emma, from the members of the church, and from the law? Plural marriage did not sit well with the majority of members due to it being biblically forbidden. Both Solomon and David were rebuked by their God for the practice. So how could it be God introduced the practice in the Bible? 1 Kings 11:9-11. And the Lord was angry with Solomon. Wherefore the Lord said unto Solomon, Forasmuch as this is done of thee, I will surely rend the kingdom from thee. And in 2 Samuel 12, verse 9-10, Wherefore hast thou despised the commandment of the Lord, to do evil in his sight? Thou hast killed Uriah the Hittite with the sword, and hast taken his wife to be thy wife. Now therefore the sword shall never depart from thine house, because thou hast despised me. First, the so-called spiritual experiences that supposedly gave them courage were often born out of fear, manipulation, and coercion. Joseph Smith didn't walk up and say, "Pray about this and see how you feel." No, he threatened eternal damnation, the loss of salvation, and severed familial bonds if they refused. Lucy Walker herself wrote that after relentless pressure from Joseph, she suffered nights of anguish and despair, only accepting after being told that rejecting him meant losing her soul. That's not a spiritual confirmation, that's religious extortion. The church follows with, many details about the early practice of plural marriage are unknown. Plural marriage was introduced among the early saints incrementally, and participants were asked to keep their actions confidential. They did not discuss their experiences publicly or in writing until after the Latter-day Saints had moved to Utah and church leaders had publicly acknowledged the practice. The historical record of early plural marriage is therefore thin. Few records of the time provide details, and later reminiscences are not always reliable. Some ambiguity will always accompany our knowledge about this issue. Like the participants, we see through a glass darkly and are asked to walk by faith. Let's be brutally clear here. The church is straight up gaslighting its members with this narrative. It wasn't a revelation to the saints at large. It was an exclusive club of Joseph Smith's inner circle, handpicked to quietly enter into polygamy behind closed doors, while the rest of the church was lied to and kept in the dark. And let's not forget, this was happening while it was illegal in both Ohio and Illinois. That's why Smith commanded secrecy, not because it was sacred, but because they were breaking the law. And the hypocrisy is staggering. The 12th article of faith literally reads, "We believe in being subject to kings, presidents, rulers, and magistrates, in obeying, honoring, and sustaining the law." Yet here was Joseph Smith, the so-called prophet of God, openly defying state law while publicly condemning others for doing the same. The only reason Brigham Young ever went public about plural marriage was because Utah wasn't part of the United States at first. There was no federal oversight, no U.S. law to answer to, so they felt emboldened to come out in the open. But the minute Utah became a U.S. territory, polygamy became a legal issue once again, because it was a federal crime. This wasn't about courage, revelation, or divine command. It was about power, control, and getting away with it while they could. And when the legal noose tightened, the church lied, gaslit, and rewrote its own history to make it look like faith instead of what it really was. A carefully orchestrated criminal enterprise disguised as religious practice. Part 2. The beginnings of plural marriage in the church. The church opens this section with, "The revelation on plural marriage was not written down until 1843, but its early verses suggest that part of it emerged from Joseph Smith's study of the Old Testament in 1831. People who knew Joseph well later stated he received the revelation about that time. The revelation, recorded in Doctrine and Covenants 132, states that Joseph prayed to know why God justified Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses, David, and Solomon in having many wives. The Lord responded that he had commanded them to enter into the practice. Latter-day Saints understood that they were living in the latter days, in what the Revelations called the dispensation of the fullness of times. Ancient principles, such as prophets, priesthood, and temples, would be restored to the earth. Plural marriage was one of those ancient principles. What a load of absolute rubbish. Let's work backwards here and dismantle this nonsense brick by brick. If this was truly a divine revelation, then why didn't Joseph Smith present it openly to the membership? Why the secrecy? Why the backroom deals, whispered proposals, and hidden marriages? Because it wasn't a revelation. It was calculated grooming for his inner circle, plain and simple. Now, as I've already hammered home in this series, the church loves to trot out their sanitized, cherry-picked list of so-called biblical polygamists to justify Joseph's behavior, and it's a flat-out lie. We just exposed Abraham, Jacob, David, and Solomon's situations for what they really were, none of which support the LDS narrative, and some of which God outright condemned. But let's keep going. What about Isaac and Moses? Isaac? Not a polygamist. Not once. Not a single verse in the Old Testament suggests he ever took a second wife. I covered this in detail back in the main Gospel Topics Essays video. Go watch it. Moses? Same deal. The church's apologists love to handwave a single verse in Numbers 12:1, where Miriam and Aaron criticize Moses for marrying an Ethiopian woman. Guess what? That could easily be Zipporah being described differently, because the text doesn't even tell us where she's from. There's zero biblical proof Moses practiced plural marriage. None. Now, yes, polygamy was rotting away in Joseph's mind as early as 1831. We have clear records of Joseph in Missouri visiting W. Phelps, Oliver Cowdery, and others during their mission to convert Native Americans, where Joseph declared that the saints would be called to take Native women as plural wives. When Phelps nervously asked how the already married men would pull that off, Joseph smugly told him they'd practice plural marriage. And let's not forget Brigham Young. He knew. He was in on it. He even backed Joseph in falsely accusing Oliver Cowdery of polygamy to discredit him after Cowdery caught Joseph in the barn with Fanny Alger. The fatal flaw in that accusation? Oliver wasn't even married yet at the time. It was a desperate smear tactic, just like everything else Smith and his cronies did to silence dissent. This wasn't revelation. It was manipulation, plain and simple. And it's about damn time more people call it what it was. The church follows up with, polygamy had been permitted for millennia in many cultures and religions, but with few exceptions was rejected in Western cultures. In Joseph Smith's time, monogamy was the only legal form of marriage in the United States. Joseph knew the practice of plural marriage would stir up public ire. After receiving the commandment, he taught a few associates about it, but he did not spread this teaching widely in the 1830s. Let's be blunt. What other cultures or religions did doesn't matter one bit. It was illegal in the states where Joseph and the church operated. No justification, no excuses. Joseph Smith wasn't living in ancient Mesopotamia or tribal Africa. He was in the United States of America. They were breaking the law, plain and simple. The church then states, when God commands a difficult task, he sometimes sends additional messengers to encourage his people to obey. Consistent with this pattern, Joseph told associates that an angel appeared to him 3 times between 1834 and 1842 and commanded him to proceed with plural marriage when he hesitated to move forward. During the 3rd and final appearance, the angel came with a drawn sword, threatening Joseph with destruction unless he went forward and obeyed the commandment fully. Is the church really telling us that God coerced women into marriages they didn't want? There is absolutely no biblical precedent for God threatening someone with death to force them into a marriage, let alone a plural marriage. The so-called angel with a drawn sword story is unique to Joseph Smith, and it reeks more of manipulation than of divine revelation or pattern. The church ends the section with, fragmentary evidence suggests that Joseph Smith acted on the angel's first command by marrying a plural wife, Fanny Alger, in Kirtland, Ohio, in the mid-1830s. Several Latter-day Saints who had lived in Kirtland reported decades later that Joseph Smith had married Alger, who lived and worked in the Smith household, after he had obtained her consent and that of her parents. Little is known about this marriage, and nothing is known about the conversations between Joseph and Emma regarding Alger. After the marriage with Alger ended in separation, Joseph seems to have set the subject of plural marriage aside until after the church moved to Nauvoo, Illinois. If Fanny Alger was truly part of a sacred God-sanctioned marriage, then why the lies? Why the secrecy? Why did Joseph Smith hide it from his own wife? Why did Emma Smith throw Fanny out of their home under a fabricated accusation, claiming she was pregnant by another man, when in reality Emma had caught Joseph and Fanny together? This wasn't some pious union sealed by divine command. It was a scandal. William Law knew it. Oliver Cowdery knew it, openly calling it a dirty, nasty, filthy affair. And conveniently, history grows silent because Fanny herself refused to ever speak of it again after fleeing to Missouri. What does that tell you? Part 3. Plural marriage and eternal marriage. The same revelation that taught of plural marriage was part of a larger revelation given to Joseph Smith, that marriage could last beyond death, and that eternal marriage was essential to inheriting the fullness that God desires for his children. As early as 1840, Joseph Smith privately taught Apostle Parley P. Pratt that the heavenly order allowed Pratt and his wife to be together for time and all eternity. Joseph also taught that men like Pratt, who had remarried following the death of his first wife, could be married or sealed to their wives for eternity under the proper conditions. The sealing of husband and wife for eternity was made possible by the restoration of priesthood keys and ordinances. On April 3, 1836, the Old Testament prophet Elijah appeared to Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery in the Kirtland Temple and restored the priesthood keys necessary to perform ordinances for the living and the dead, including sealing families together. Marriages performed by priesthood authority could link loved ones to each other for eternity, on condition of righteousness. Marriages performed without this authority would end at death. Once again, absolute rubbish. Joseph Smith wasn't securing eternal families. He was stealing other men's wives. These were women already married to men who, under the very doctrines Smith was inventing, should have had the right to be sealed to their own spouses for eternity. If this was about salvation, if this was truly about securing the eternities for God's children, then why was Smith and his inner circle targeting married women? Because it wasn't about salvation. It was about power, control, and lust. It was a con, plain and simple, sexually greedy men preying on women they desired under the guise of divine command. And we know this isn't speculation. Many of Smith's plural wives openly testified during the Temple Lot trial that they had physical relations with him while he was alive. Salvation had nothing to do with it. This was about gratification. Take Pratt. His story alone exposes the lie. Pratt initially rejected polygamy, even confronting Smith when Joseph approached Pratt's own wife, Sarah. And while Pratt later became one of polygamy's most vocal defenders, Sarah never approved. She rejected Smith's advances, rejected plural marriage, and never accepted her husband's other wives. If this was the eternal will of God, why were faithful, believing women like Sarah saying no? And then we have Smith's conveniently unverifiable account of Elijah and Elias appearing together to restore sealing power. The problem? Elijah and Elias are the same person. One name is Hebrew, the other is Greek. There's no scriptural precedent for them being separate beings appearing at the same time. This wasn't a revelation, it was a fabrication. And yet the church keeps parroting nonsense like marriage performed by priesthood authority meant that the procreation of children and perpetuation of families would continue into the eternities. Joseph Smith's revelation on marriage declared that the continuation of the seeds forever and ever helped to fulfill God's purposes for his children. But if Smith and his cronies were marrying other men's wives, doesn't that mean those men were robbed of their wives in the afterlife? Were they robbed of the ability to have children with their own wives now? How is that righteous? How is that divine? It's selfish, it's predatory. And if you step back and think logically, it's utterly indefensible. Part 4. Plural marriage in Nauvoo. For much of Western history, family interest, economic, political, and social considerations dominated the choice of spouse. Parents had the power to arrange marriages or forestall unions of which they disapproved. By the late 1700s, romance and personal choice began to rival these traditional motives and practices. By Joseph Smith's time, many couples insisted on marrying for love, as he and Emma did when they eloped against her parents' wishes. Latter-day Saints' motives for plural marriage were often more religious than economic or romantic. Besides the desire to be obedient, a strong incentive was the hope of living in God's presence with family members. In the revelation on marriage, the Lord promised participants crowns of eternal lives and exaltation in the eternal worlds. Men and women, parents and children, ancestors and progeny were to be sealed to each other, their commitment lasting into the eternities, consistent with Jesus' promise that priesthood ordinances performed on earth could be bound in heaven. As for that first part, What in the world does it have to do with anything about plural marriage? Absolutely nothing. It's a distraction tactic, plain and simple, meant to derail the conversation and deflect from the real issue, the exploitation of women under the guise of divine authority. And as for the latter point, here we are again, running in circles. Back to the undeniable reality that Joseph Smith and his cronies were robbing married men of their wives both in this life and, according to their own theology, in the next. What more can even be said? It is what it was. Predatory men using religion as a tool for personal gain, lust, and control. Then the church trots out this carefully worded, whitewashed statement. The first plural marriage in Nauvoo took place when Louisa Beeman and Joseph Smith were sealed in April 1841. Joseph married many additional wives and authorized other Latter-day Saints to practice plural marriage. The practice spread slowly at first. By June 1844, when Joseph died, approximately 29 men and 50 women had entered into plural marriage, in addition to Joseph and his wives. When the Saints entered the Salt Lake Valley in 1847, at least 196 men and 521 women had entered into plural marriages. Participants in these early plural marriages pledged to keep their involvement confidential, though they anticipated a time when the practice would be publicly acknowledged. Let's cut through the fluff. The overwhelming majority of those 29 men were general authorities. At least 7 of the original quorum of the 12 were secretly involved. The upper leadership, Whitney, Noble, Clayton, Bennett, all deeply entangled in this web. Even Hiram and William Smith, Joseph's own brothers, were in on it. These weren't scattered converts testing a new doctrine. This was a coordinated, top-down operation of spiritual manipulation and sexual exploitation. They then state, nevertheless, rumors spread. A few men unscrupulously used these rumors to seduce women to join them in an unauthorized practice sometimes referred to as spiritual wifery. When this was discovered, the men were cut off from the church. The rumors prompted members and leaders to issue carefully worded denials that denounced spiritual wifery and polygamy, but were silent about what Joseph Smith and others saw as divinely mandated celestial plural marriage. The statements emphasized that the church practiced no marital law other than monogamy, while implicitly leaving open the possibility that individuals, under direction of God's living prophet, might do so. Rumors didn't just spread, they exploded. William Smith was using Joseph Smith's own supposed authority as a tool to manipulate women into sleeping with him. And when it came to light, what did the leadership do? Did they expose him? Hold him accountable? Of course not. The Nauvoo Council launched an investigation, and under Joseph Smith's direct orders, Brigham Young moved to bury it. The entire thing was covered up, but someone had to take the fall, so they threw John C. Bennett to the wolves, made him the scapegoat, pinned every scandal, every illicit act, every whispered accusation on him. They hung Bennett out to dry, and to his credit, he didn't go quietly. He turned on them and went straight for their throats, exposing the rot at the core of Nauvoo's leadership. And let's be clear, those so-called sanctions to practice plural marriage, that wasn't church-wide revelation. It wasn't open counsel. It was Joseph Smith and a tight circle of his most loyal inner ring of enablers and opportunists